Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Alexis Rogers and I'm the Customer Relationship Lead here at RightCapital. And welcome to our webinar today on dynamic spending strategies and the real retirement journey. As we know, retirement spending can be a very personal topic for clients, and when it comes to the actuality of spending behavior, a lot of times this can fluctuate in terms of specific client behavior. So within RightCapital, we recognize that each client has unique financial needs and goals. That's why we offer innovative dynamic spending strategies that can allow you to adjust the client's spending strategies to reflect what you want to recommend and also the reality of what a lot of clients might be following for their true spending nature in retirement. Especially as over 70% of retirees are expressing concerns about outliving their savings, it's more important than ever to take control of retirement planning and spending discussions. So today we're going to be highlighting all of those key different strategies in RightCapital. We're going to be walking through how you can apply those dynamic spending strategies, how you can fine tune the current plan to reflect what the client's current path is in terms of spending behavior. And then we're going to walk through how you can create custom proposals in terms of different spending strategies. We're also going to highlight all the key visuals that you can leverage to paint the picture to a client in terms of which path might be best resonating with their plan in terms of what their goals are in retirement and any true to nature spending habits there might be, and also some of those goals in terms of income in retirement. We're also going to be highlighting all the different resources that you do have available to you when leveraging RightCapital. One of those resources being that during this webinar, you do have the opportunity to use the questions dropdown. So feel free to type out your questions there. More than happy to engage with you that way. But shifting gears into RightCapital. Today we're going to be looking at the Lannister family plan. And right now we're just going to review what their current path looks like to paint the picture of what we're going to be selecting for them before we dive into making a proposal. For the Lannisters, starting in Profile Blueprint, where we can see this easy to digest visual of their current path, we can see that their net worth, they have a $3 million net worth roughly. They're in their early 60s with a child that's still in college. They have some pretty nice account balances and a nice primary home included in their net worth as well, and a little bit of remaining debt off the primary home. For their goals, we, like I said, have the child still attending college for a couple more years. We have a vacation goal coming up, and then we have them retiring in a couple years. So on the precipice of retiring for these clients. So their spending discussion is even more vital as we are on the precipice of deciding what that's going to look like for their future. We also want to note that there is a primary home relocation happening at the year of retirement. So they plan on downsizing and moving when they retire, following that very common scenario that a lot of clients might be pursuing and relocating to a different state. So you have a lot going on at age 67 in 2027. In terms of income, savings, expenses, they have some pretty decent income. We are going to be relying on Social Security for each of them. We have them filing at 67 for Tyrion, 70 for Angelina, which is going to come into play when we're talking about their spending habits in retirement. And they plan on saving pretty well until they retire. One of the key things when it comes to retirement spending and their retirement goal, and this can be seen both in Profile Blueprint Goals or in the actual Profile Goals tab. But in the Blueprint module, we can also click on the retirement monthly expenses to check in about what their current plan's retirement monthly expenses are. For their current plan, we currently have their retirement monthly expense goal at $12,000 a month. Right now for our spending strategy, we have the default selected, which is inflation adjusted. What this means is that we are going to be showing this expense growing with inflation, general inflation each year. But there are a multitude of different spending realities when it comes to the retirement picture. There's a lot of spending habits that we want to make sure we're also accounting for. For their current plan though, we are going to be using inflation adjusted because that's kind of the conversation. And we're going to walk through making proposals and illustrating different spending strategies. But if you needed to make an adjustment to the spending strategy for the current plan, that can be accomplished in Profile Goals or Profile Blueprint Goals as we just illustrated. But going back into our advisor portal, this is where we can go to easily define what the retirement spending strategies themselves are. So in the advisor portal, if we go to models, retirement spending, this is where we can see the details for the default spending strategies. And it's also where we can go to create custom spending strategies, which we're going to review in a little bit. But starting with the baseline default retirement spending strategy, as we reviewed, inflation adjusted is simply going to be illustrating the retirement living expenses as growing within general inflation each year. The second option in terms of retirement spending strategies is going to be looking at retirement spending smile. This is also referred to in the industry as the Blanchett spending smile, but here it's going to be called retirement spending smile. You can also retitle this if desired by just clicking on the pencil icon, and then you can retitle it from here and hitting the check mark. For now, we're going to leave it at the default though. The intention with the retirement spending smile is the idea that we are going to be having retirement expenses still growing each year, but it's the idea that it's not going to be growing as rapidly as general inflation, and that healthcare costs as clients get older will come to supersede the cost of retirement living expenses, therefore creating a smile when we're looking at analyzing the spending behavior of a client's retirement picture. So in the retirement spending smile page, this is where we can go to define what we want to see in terms of how much we're going to be reducing the inflation increase. So it's going to be looking at the retirement living expenses, and it's going to be adjusting those and growing those with inflation minus 1%. So for example, my general inflation figure is 2.5%. If I illustrate right here and indicate 1%, that means that the retirement living expenses are going to be growing with 1.5% each year. The third option in terms of retirement dynamic spending, and a very popular one as well, is the retirement spending stages strategy. This is going to be breaking up retirement spending into 3 different stages. The first stage in terms of client behavior is going to be looking at the idea that the first couple years of retirement, or however long we want to define, is typically when clients spend the most. Then we break it up to the second stage, which we can define by clicking into this field right here. Right now we have that second stage starting at 75, for example. We then show a little bit of a slowdown in spending habits and show an adjustment and a decrease in spending habits by 15%. Then in the third stage, closer towards the end of life, for them it's 85, we'd show a third and final decrease in living expenses by 5%. The next option in terms of retirement dynamic spending strategies is going to be looking at the floor and ceiling strategy. This is essentially creating a corridor for spending, and it's going to be allowing for a little bit more of a fluctuation in terms of market behavior. So this is especially key for when we have maybe a strategy of spending less when markets are down or spending more if markets are up. The idea behind the floor and ceiling and the guardrails, which we're going to touch on in a second, but the floor and ceiling is going to be essentially limiting the spending reduction to 15% below the initial retirement living expense amount. It is going to be considered inflation adjusted though. And you can establish that ceiling, which is going to be limiting the spending increase to 20% above the initial retirement expense amount. So this allows for the spending habits to be essentially increasing with higher returning markets versus lower returning markets, but we are establishing a corridor, so we're never going to supersede what we're establishing here for these bands. Continuing off of that idea is the guardrail strategy. The guardrail strategy, also referred to as the Guyton-Klinger decision rules, is essentially being a little bit more refined or specific in what we're doing in terms of the idea of fluctuating with market returns or market conditions for spending habits. One of the key things here is the inflation adjustment rule. If we have this selected, this means that we'd show no inflation adjustment to the living expenses if the previous year's return is 0 or negative. But with the capital preservation rule and the prosperity rule, this is where we can establish a little bit more of a specific set of corridors for spending behavior. So we can define what that looks like. We can say that this will apply only before the client's age 80. And if their withdrawal rate is 20% greater than the initial withdrawal rate, we'd be reducing spending by 10%. On the flip side, with a prosperity rule, this would also be applying before age 80 for the clients. And if their withdrawal rate is 20% lower than the initial rate, we'd increase spending by 10%. Another key thing that's important to note as we're looking at client plans is the ability to be specific in terms of what we want to consider for the initial withdrawal rate. For the initial withdrawal rate, right now we have it set to calculated. This means that it's going to be looking at the first year of retirement and looking at what the withdrawal rate is for that year, which we can leave for now. But this is also a space where you can manually override and indicate that you want to have it overridden to a specific withdrawal rate. So if we wanted to have it specified that we don't want it to be anything other than 4%, we can specify that from here. In this case, we're going to leave this as is and leave the defaults. But this is where we can go to define what the defaults are. Those are what we have currently set up. And we're going to touch on how to create custom ones later on. But going back to our client plan, and going to the retirement analysis, this is where we're going to be creating our proposed strategy and also illustrating the impacts of different retirement spending stages and strategies. Here under retirement analysis, this is where we're going to be greeted with our probability of success, which is that first gauge of financial well-being. This is going to be right now what we have for the current plan, looking at the Monte Carlo simulations and the 1,000 trials of market volatility. And it's the percentage of those trials that make it to the end of plan without running out of money. So with the current plan and what we have entered for their goals, their income, savings, expenses, and for their current path, they have a 93% probability of success. But as we know, when it comes to retirement spending, there's a multitude of different paths that a client might be taken. And we're going to start to illustrate what that looks like and also compare and contrast all these different types of spending strategies. So I have a couple different proposals already curated. We're going to start with guardrails, for example. To create multiple proposals, I want to note you can do that by just clicking on the pencil icon directly to the right of the current plan. And from there, you can copy your proposed plan and build off of it, or you can select add a new plan, which we need to do for the floor and ceiling strategy. So we're going to click on add new plan. We're going to title this. Hit the check mark to save the name change, hit OK, and this will allow for us to have multiple proposed plans. But starting with the guardrail strategy, we're going to navigate to the action items, and this is where we go to start to curate our proposed plan, which right now we are focusing on the guardrails as the name entails. So to do that, we're going to look at applying a strategy, and we'll focus on the retirement spending strategies. So right now, we're using inflation adjusted for the current plan. We're going to illustrate the proposal of looking at guardrails. So we can select that from the drop-down, hit the refresh button, and we're going to see how that's going to impact their probability of success, and also the green bar chart, which is referencing the median trials ending asset value from the 1,000 trials of market volatility. So you can kind of see what that looks like, how that impacts their behavior. The retirement details tab right here is another very helpful reference point in terms of what the retirement picture looks like. This is where we can see the income sources, the stability income ratio. But if we click on this drop down, it's also where we can go to check in terms of withdrawal rate. So especially when we're looking at the guardrails, the withdrawal rate is an important factor there. So for them in their first year of retirement, their withdrawal rate's 4.2%, which is comfortable in terms of what we want to see for them. But especially if we're trying to keep in mind if they have a big pull from their assets the first year of retirement, which some clients might, that might be an opportunity in which we would want to maybe create a custom spending strategy in terms of the guardrails to establish that you want to override it to a specific withdrawal rate in order to be refined in the guardrails. But for this case, this works for their plan. We also wanted to analyze a couple of different other ones. So we're going to start to activate the spending stages one. So we're going to select that from the left-hand drop-down, go down to action items. We're going to toggle from the retirement spending strategies to retirement spending stages, hit refresh, and we're going to see how that impacts their probability of success. Another key thing to note, still under retirement details, is going to be the retirement spending figures. This is a great chart that will visualize over time and also show you the total spending in retirement in terms of retirement expenses, especially healthcare, which can be a very hefty cost, and a lot of the other big expenses, including taxes. So this can be another reference point when we're trying to analyze what is happening with the retirement spending strategies that we're illustrating, and also just to paint the picture of what we're actually spending on in retirement. We're also going to toggle to retirement spending smile. So especially for that chart that we were just looking at with the healthcare costs, the retirement spending smile is going to be a key one for looking at that spending behavior. So under action items, once again, we're going to toggle to the retirement spending strategies, click on retirement spending smile, hit refresh, and apply it to our proposal. And under retirement details, we can use this drop down to go back to retirement spending and see how that impacts their spending behavior from here. So as you can see, the healthcare is still pretty hefty cost, especially when you consider long-term care, but it is growing a little bit more in comparison to other ones. And then finally, we're going to look at the floor and ceiling strategy. Once again, going to action items, selecting floor and ceiling from the retirement spending strategy dropdown, and seeing how that works with their plan. So as you can see, it's a 97% probability success. And under retirement details, a great space to go to check in terms of retirement spending, what that looks like for them. This is also where we can go to compare and contrast multiple proposals. So right now we're comparing against the current plan, which has a inflation adjusted strategy selected, but we can also use this drop down on the right hand side to compare and contrast against other different types of strategies. So especially if we're trying to compare against which one might be better suited, we can use these toggles right here to compare and contrast for that probability success. The comparisons tab right here is also another visual that will be analyzing the cash flow level projections of these two scenarios. The cash flow projections are going to be considering a straight line projection, so it's a different calculation in the probability and confidence tabs. So comparison is going to be not factoring in volatility into the baseline, but we can also illustrate from this drop down applying different sequences of returns. This is especially beneficial when we're trying to analyze something that is fluctuating with market performance in particular. But under comparisons, this is where we can see the visual comparison of the invested assets from the two plans. You can also see the visual comparison in terms of net worth, taxes, and assets at retirement. But once again, this is also a good one to see in terms of if we did illustrate poorer markets, how does that impact their particular plan as well? But this is just isolating the differences between the default strategies. For the Lannisters in particular, their potential path and in terms of their client behavior is going to be a little bit more reflecting the spending stages strategy, but theirs is a little bit more refined than what we have currently for our default. So we're going to create a custom one just for them. So if we go back to our advisor portal and go to models, retirement spending, we can click on add spending strategy to start to create a custom one. What we're creating here, it's important to note, can be used across multiple clients. That's perfectly fine, but it can be used just for a specific client if we needed to make one very niche to their needs, which is what we're going to be doing for the Lannisters at the very least. So we're going to click on the pencil icon right here to retitle this. to Lannister stages. You can retitle it to whatever is the best suited name for this. From there, we then select what type of strategy we are going to be using. They're going to be following a similar path to retirement spending stages, which is going to be breaking up their spending habits into stages. For them, the first years of retirement, they're going to be very aggressive in terms of spending behavior, growing with inflation. Then at the secondary stage, we're going to show them actually decreasing their spending a little bit more aggressive than 10%. They plan on cutting back a lot and focusing on just staying at home. And the third stage is going to start a little bit earlier for them at age 80. And especially for them, if we're considering the potential of their planning horizon and the nuances of when we're planning that they pass away, for them, it makes more sense for the third stage to start at 80. And they have a little bit more of an aggressive decrease at that third stage as well. So we can modify each of these parameters to reflect the client's true to behavior needs. Once we have that saved, we can go back to our clients list, search for the Lannisters. And now if we go back to retirement analysis, we're going to use the proposed plan to illustrate the comparison between current plan, which is inflation adjusted, versus the one that we just curated that is custom to them. So to go down to the action items, we're once again going to select our custom strategy from the retirement spending strategies dropdown, hit refresh to illustrate that true to client behavior for them. And we want to compare against the current plan. So we're going to toggle to the current plan to show that juxtaposition of what their client spending behavior looks like versus the current plan. We can see that difference between the comparison of probability success and that median trials ending asset value. Once again, we can check in for the retirement details to see what is happening in terms of the retirement picture for income sources, but also withdrawal rate over time, and also the retirement spending as well. Under comparisons, this is also where we can see that information in terms of the comparison of the invested assets, the net worth, and taxes paid. So for them and their plan, this makes the most sense. But one of the key insights that we can also use to kind of see what's happening for their plan can also be found under retirement cash flows. So now that we have all those different strategies indicated in our proposals, the cash flows is going to be a great space to check in to see exactly what's happening with their spending, but also to see what's happening with their inflows and outflows each year. Once again, clicking on the summary tab, so retirement cash flow summary, and we're going to make sure that the proposed plan is the one toggled because we're going to focus on this one right now, but we can switch between other cash flows as needed. So this is a great space to see that year by year breakdown of the cash inflows and cash outflows. We can see that when they retire, that year we have that other inflow coming in from the sale of the property. We can see exactly where this money is coming from by just clicking on the column header for the other inflows. It's the sale of real estate and it's the primary home. Anytime we see something underlined in RightCapital, it's a key indicator that we can click into it to see additional information. And that's going to be true when we're focusing on the expenses. So here in expenses, we can click on the header of expenses, see the breakdown of living expenses. We see that shift happening when they retire to retirement living expenses, of course. And we can also see at those different stages that we specified that drop in spending at 75 and also at 80. And then we have them passing on a little bit later as well. So it's a great space to see what's happening in terms of the living expenses themselves and those figures, but also just to check in terms of seeing what is happening with the inflows for a particular year versus the outflows. So particularly if maybe for other strategies like the guardrails, we have a huge pull from the assets, we can also see that from here as well. And that could be that indicator to go and navigate back to the advisor portal and redefine the guardrails and override that withdrawal rate as needed. And if we wanted to incorporate this as part of the current plan and what we just curated for that strategy, that can be done by going back to profile goals. It can also be accomplished under blueprint goals as well. And here we'd navigate to the retirement expense card, and we can go to the retirement living expenses, spending strategy, And we'll also find our custom strategy included here. So we can select that from the list, include it, and that's now going to be a part of their current path and their current plan. And so we can have that toggle there and still use the retirement analysis to illustrate the comparison between different strategies, analyze the impacts and see which one might make the most sense for them. But that important factor that always plays a key role here is the client behavior and also what you might be recommending as well, of course. In the action items, this is also where we can accomplish it. But especially if we're trying to analyze spending more or less, that is also a good time in which we might be illustrating different retirement spending strategies. So for example, if we wanted to illustrate them spending more, $1,000 more, and we wanted to see how that would impact their plan, now that we have them having a little bit more of a dynamic spending strategy, we can see how that would impact all the different proposals by selecting the left-hand drop-down, choosing which one we wanted to illustrate the increase in retirement living expenses, and how that might impact their poverty success and plan, because I see that was also a question in the comments as well. So we can see here that with the idea of the guardrails, they increase spending, it is dropping their poverty success in comparison to the specific custom strategy for them of spending less for those different stages that we created for the current plan. Another great question that I'm also seeing that I wanted to cover as well is to review how you can create and override the withdrawal rate for guardrails. So going back to the advisor portal, models, retirement spending, under guardrails, this is where we can define what those parameters are for the client picture. But let's say for the Lannisters, for example, for them applying this before age 80 is not necessarily making sense with their picture. So we're going to create another custom one for the guardrail strategy for them. So we're going to click on Add Spending Strategy, click on the pencil icon, title this for our ease, change the strategy type to guardrails. We're going to keep the inflation adjustment option selected. And we're going to have this one be a little bit more aggressive for them, have it be applied before age 85 if relevant. And this one, we're going to make the guardrails a little bit more of a smaller corridor in terms of what they are going to be reducing spending by. And the prosperity rule as well. So for them and their client behavior, they are a little bit more concerned with the end or closer to end of life spending behavior. They typically are going to be spending less. So we're going to be changing these parameters right here for the prosperity rule before age 75. If the withdrawal rate is 20% lower than the initial withdrawal rate, we can increase spending by 10%. And in this case, we want to ensure that the initial withdrawal rate, even though we know it's at 4.2%, that it's overridden to 4.0%, hit save. And now we can go back to the clients list. And let's compare that against what we have for our custom strategy for the current plan. So going to retirement analysis, and we're actually going to keep the guardrails plan selected. We're going to reset this back to the current plan's spending behavior, and then we're going to change the retirement spending strategy to the Lannisters guardrails. Hit refresh and see how that impacts their plan. So as you can see, they're both pretty close. They're 100% poverty success, which is a good thing, of course. And we can see that comparisons tab to see the different type of projection in terms of how that's impacting the baseline projection. Once again, this drop down right here is where you can apply different sequences of return. So we can see what would happen if we applied a bad decade followed by slow growth. So particularly when we have guardrails, that's going to be triggered by market performance. So we can see that analysis of what's happening here if we apply some of these poor market sequences to the cash flow level projections for the comparisons tab. So a lot of great information can be found here in terms of comparison and that juxtaposition of which path might be best suited for the client. especially if we might be pulling back in poor market conditions or spending a little bit more when the markets are higher, or maybe we're cutting back and doing just the 3 stages. This is a great way to compare and contrast both here in the comparisons, the probability tab, but you can also create those custom ones to really be more in tune with what we know the client might be doing in their livelihoods now, but also in retirement with those custom spending strategies.